Well, good morning and welcome. I'm Ray. I serve as the worship pastor here. I've been here for about 13 years doing that. Every once in a while, I get to preach. They try to spread it out because I don't really know a lot. So I just say the same thing over and over and wait for you to forget it till they let me preach again. Um, if you are a visitor here, we're really glad that you chose to be with us for an hour or two or three today. It will only be an hour. I'm only kidding about that. If you would take a moment just to grab your communication card and fill that out, we'd love to be in contact with you. If there's things that we could pray for you about, you can just put those on the back, and we get together and pray every Tuesday through that entire list as a staff. So. Just to give you a little background, since the beginning of the year, we've talked through a lot of different messages. We've had several different series, and I'd just like to recap those for you. I'm not sure it does us a whole lot of good to come week after week with brand new messages if we don't ever look back and think, how am I doing on some of those? Have I moved the ball forward any in some of those areas? The beginning of the year started with a series called Important Prayers, and we had 3 different prayers that we just offered up to God and kind of expounded on those, and that was God to search me, to save me, and send me. After that, we jumped into a series that led us right up to Easter called Living Like Jesus. And some of the areas where we challenged ourselves were to love God, to love your neighbor, to love the unlovely, to love the helpless. That was our Orphan Emphasis Sunday. To be the church, to be a friend of sinners, to be sure of your relationship with God, to be humble, and then on Easter Sunday, to be victorious. After that, we jumped into a series called Greater Than. It was the idea that God is greater than all of these things in your life. He's greater than your mistakes. He's greater than your hurts, than your circumstances, and than your doubts. After that, we jumped into a series called Wonder Woman with everybody's favorite theme song that Lee got really tired of. And we talked about some great women from the Bible named Abigail and Hannah and Priscilla and Lois and Eunice, and how God used them in a powerful way, worked through their lives to change things. After that, we jumped into a series called When God, and it just said, when God doesn't make sense, when God makes perfect sense, when God is your Father on Father's Day, and when God works through unlikely people. And most recently, we find ourselves in this series called Favorites. You know, that bumper that we use every week that just scans through a lot of some of my favorite things. In the video that has Gretchen picking out a stuffed animal, though, just for clarification, that was a favorite stuffed animal for her. I'm not saying Gretchen is my favorite child. My kids were ready to have a mutiny when I did that, so it was interesting. I mean, she is, but I wasn't going to tell them that. I'm just kidding. But the first Sunday we talked about Psalm 23, and just that's such a beloved passage for so many of us. The Lord is my shepherd. And right after that, last week, we talked about David and Goliath, and how that's a great story that you don't even have to be exposed to church, and you know that story. This week, we're talking about one of my favorite stories from the Old Testament, and it's Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal. I love the Star Wars movies. I was born in 1974, so I was just 3 years old when the entire world was introduced for the first time to Luke Skywalker, the Millennium Falcon, the Force, and Darth Vader, and all those great characters that have just defined so many things about our culture. I remember seeing Empire Strikes Back in theaters as a little guy. I couldn't have been, I guess, maybe 7 years old or so. And then I also remember standing in line for what felt like forever in the middle of the night to go see Return of the Jedi. As a little kid, I thought, I've waited 20 years for this movie. I hadn't even been alive 10 years, but it just felt like it was taking forever to find out what happened and if, Han was going to be freed from the carbonite that they'd frozen him in and all that nerdy stuff. But since I never saw the first movie in the theaters, we had to wait quite a while for me to even know what happened in that very first movie called Star Wars. Did anybody, when you all were kids, did any of your parents go to the library and check out the reel-to-reel projectors? No? That must have been a North Carolina thing. But we would go do that, and I remember watching Roots, actually, if you remember that old, incredibly long series that we watched all of that on a sheet like stuck to our wall in our house. I remember we would get on waiting lists for movies until they would come out on those films, and then we would watch them on the sheet. So I had to wait quite a while to get to see Star Wars. And, kids today will never understand the level of patience that took, because films would be on multiple reels of film. When you finished one, you got charged if you didn't roll it back onto the other film. So it'd be some climactic scene. You'd run out of film and hear the tick, 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 tick as it finished, and you'd have to wait again, as a child, what felt like forever for it to roll back up on the other film just to be able to see the next part. So I remember as a kid too, my friend and I played Frogger, if any of you remember that old video game, and it would load from a cassette tape drive. And we would wake up at 7, plug it in, and press load, and then by 5 o'clock that night, we'd get to play Frogger, which is not an exaggeration. But anyhow, so it took a long time before I would get to see, what happened in those first moments of the Star Wars movies. But if you remember, it kind of starts out and throws you right into the action of things are bad. You don't really know why they're bad, and the movie goes to sort of explain all of that. Our story today is not too dissimilar than that. We jump into the middle of this story of Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal, and without some backstory, we won't really know what's going on. So most of our time today is going to be spent just reading the text. There's a great passage in the Bible that says faith comes from hearing, and hearing comes from the Word of God. There's also another passage that we can take together with that says it's impossible without faith to please God. So I think this is a good way for us to spend some of our time today. In the Bible narrative, if we go back, we know that God called Abraham to leave everything that he knew and go to a land that he would give to him and his descendants as a blessing. Abraham, in his old age, had a son that God had promised to him, and then God asked him to sacrifice his son. But God, which is one of my 2 favorite words in the Bible, but God. Anytime that appears in the text, something great is about to happen. But God spared him, and he applauded Abraham for his incredible faith. Isaac went on to have a son named Jacob, who would later be called Israel, and Israel would have 12 sons who would then become the nation of Israel. One of his sons, the favorite, Joseph, would be sold into slavery by his brothers, and he ends up in Egypt, and there through a series of ups and downs, he eventually becomes the second most powerful man in the country, just below Pharaoh, who was the ruler. This would allow him to save his betraying brothers and his father and their families from a famine that consumed the world. They would enjoy a favored position for a time in Egypt, but then be pressed into slavery by a new Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph and didn't know God. There's a couple of things that happen in our story today that I just want to point out as we give some of this backstory. And the first one is this idea of the curse of Jericho. After God calls Moses with a simple message to deliver to Pharaoh, he says, "Let my people go." Moses objects because he says, "I can't speak." And in my imagination, I picture God sitting in heaven, counting innumerable stars that are all throughout our universe, listening to Moses complain about having to say 4 words. And so God says, "Okay, you big baby, take Aaron with you, and he'll speak for you." And so the message goes to Pharaoh. We all know that, Pharaoh doesn't listen to the message. He doesn't let the people go until God moves in an incredibly powerful way. And then they find themselves leaving Egypt. They cross the Red Sea. They receive the 10 Commandments. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Then Joshua succeeds Moses as the leader of Israel. God had promised the land to the nation, and after they crossed into the promised land, their very first battle happens at a place called Jericho. God doesn't just help win the battle, though. Before it even starts, he says, "You win, Joshua. My people win. And this land is yours because it was mine first." So that's the equivalent of a 6th grade scrawny kid going up against the school bully. And just before the fight, Conor McGregor steps in and says, "I got this one for you." God steps in and wins the battle dramatically. Joshua 6:26 says that after God's miraculous defeat of Jericho, Joshua pronounced that any who attempted to rebuild the city of Jericho would do so at the cost of their sons' lives. So that's the curse of Jericho. That'll play into our story just a little bit later. The pattern emerges after that in Israel that really has happened in the world ever since Adam and Eve stood before the snake in the garden. And that pattern is rebellion from God and then deliverance by God. God spends years raising up judges like Samson and Gideon to deliver the people, his people, from oppression. He's faithful, but despite that, eventually the people of Israel ask for a king. Don't miss this. Even this request was an act of rebellion because God had been leading the people personally. God had been personally providing judges to deliver them. But they wanted to be like the rest of the world, and they were pulling away from God. So God gives them what they wanted, but not what they needed. And in this way, it's kind of a foreshadowing of the fact that one day, God would give them what they needed, but not what they wanted in the person of Jesus. A king, but not the kind of military king they wanted that would deliver them in a physical way, but a king that would establish the kingdom of God the church, and that's you and I, that's lasted for 2,000 years and cannot be conquered by the world. We know the empty tomb then also is sort of foreshadowing for the distant future when God sends what we all want and what we all need, and that's a triumphant Jesus who is undeniably the conquering king of the universe. So back to the kings of Israel then. Sadly, most of them have a simple phrase that follows their names, and that phrase is, "And he did evil in the sight of the Lord." It's interesting that when Jesus comes throughout the New Testament, he's described as a king who only does what the Father, God, tells him to do. So if we look at this lineage of kings then, the very first king is Saul, who's followed by David, who then is followed by Solomon. And after Solomon, things get a little dicey, and the kingdom splits in two. Rehoboam starts the line of kings that leads on down, and then Jeroboam is on the other side, and there's a line of kings with terrible names: Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, Ella. You should write notes because we have a quiz on the way out, and if you can't write all of these, you can't leave. Then Zimri, I'm just kidding about that, Omri, and Ahab. And Ahab is the king that we find in the middle of this story today. If we jump back to Jeroboam, this is another concept that happens in our story of the sin of Jeroboam. He was the first king of the divided Israel. So remember, we had Saul, then we had David, then Solomon, and then the kingdom splits between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Jeroboam is the first king of Israel. He sets up idols for the people to worship in Bethel and Dan instead of Jerusalem, and he called priests from tribes other than Levi. Levi was one of the 12 tribes, and God said, all of the priests come from this tribe. But Jeroboam went against that. He also built shrines on high places for people to worship. Anybody remember out of the 10 Commandments, the first one, the big one, no other gods before me? It's almost like God was serious when he said that. So that's the backstory that we need for our story. We're going to jump right in. This starts in 1 Kings 16. And again, just to remind you, you're going to have to be patient. This is a long narrative, but it sets the story, and we're going to look at some different observations once we finish going through this. It says, Ahab became king of Israel. It was in the 38th year that Asa was king of Judah. Ahab ruled over Israel and Samaria for 22 years. He was the son of Omri. Ahab, the son of Omri, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did more evil things than any of the kings who'd ruled before him. He thought it was only a small thing to commit the sins Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, had committed. Ahab also married Jezebel. She was Ethbal's daughter. Ethbal was king of the people of Sidon. Ahab began to serve the god named Baal and worship him. He set up an altar to honor Baal. He set it up in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made a pole used to worship the female god named Asherah. He made the Lord very angry. Ahab did more to make him angry than all the kings of Israel had done before him. The Lord is the God of Israel. In Ahab's time, Hillel from Bethel rebuilt Jericho, and when he laid its foundations, it cost him the life of his oldest son, Abiram. When he set up its gates, it cost him the life of his youngest son, Segub. That's what the Lord had said would happen. He had spoken it through Joshua, the son of Nun. Remember, that's the curse of Jericho that we mentioned. Elijah was from Tishbe in the land of Gilead, and he said to Ahab, I serve the Lord. He's the God of Israel. You can be sure that he lives, and you can be just as sure that there won't be any dew or rain on the whole land. There won't be any during the next few years. It won't come until I say so. Then a message came to Elijah from the Lord. He said, leave this place, go east and hide in the Kerith Valley. It is east of the Jordan River. You will drink water from the brook, and I have directed some ravens to supply you with food there. So Elijah did what the Lord had told him to do. He went to the Kerith Valley. It was east of the Jordan River. He stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning. They also brought him bread and meat in the evening, and he drank water from the brook. Sometime later, the brook dried up. It hadn't rained in the land for quite a while. A message came to Elijah from the Lord. He said, go right away to Zarephath in the region of Sidon. Stay there. I've directed a widow there to supply you with food. So Elijah went to Zarephath. He came to the town gate, and a widow was there gathering sticks. He called out to her. He asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar? I need a drink. So she went to get the water. Then he called out to her, please bring me a piece of bread too. I don't have any bread, she replied. And that's just as sure as the Lord your God is alive. All I have is a small amount of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home. I'll make one last meal for myself and my son. We'll eat it, and after that, we'll die. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home. Do what you've said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me. Make it out of what you have and bring it to me. Then make some for yourself and your son. The Lord is the God of Israel, and he says the jar of flour will not be used up. The jug will always have oil in it. You will have flour and oil until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." And for the historians in the room, this is actually the first recorded account of unlimited breadsticks. You laughed, thanks. I didn't know how that would go over. So she went away and did what Elijah had told her to do. So Elijah had food every day. There was also food for the woman and her family. The jar of flour wasn't used up. The jug always had oil in it, and that's what the Lord had said would happen. He had spoken that message through Elijah. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became sick. He got worse and worse, and finally he stopped breathing. The woman said to Elijah, "You are a man of God. What do you have against me? Did you come to bring my sin out into the open? Did you come to kill my son?" "Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms. He carried him to the upstairs room where he was staying, and he put him down on his bed. Then Elijah cried out to the Lord. He said, "Lord my God, I'm staying with this widow. Have you brought pain and sorrow even to her? Have you caused her son to die?" Then he lay down on the boy 3 times. He cried out to the Lord, and he said, "Lord my God, give this boy's life back to him." The Lord answered Elijah's prayer. He gave the boy's life back to him, so the boy lived. Elijah picked up the boy. He carried him down from the upstairs room into his house. He gave him to his mother, and he said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God. I know that the message you have brought from the Lord is true." It was now 3 years since it had rained. A message came to Elijah from the Lord. He said, "Go, speak to Ahab. Then I will send rain on the land." So Elijah went to speak to Ahab. There wasn't enough food in Samaria, and the people there were very hungry. Ahab had sent for Obadiah. He was in charge of Ahab's palace. Obadiah had great respect for the Lord. Ahab's wife, Jezebel, had been killing off the Lord's prophets. So Obadiah had hidden 100 prophets in 2 caves. He put 50 in each cave and supplied them with food and water. Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land, go to all the valleys and springs of water. Maybe we can find some grass there. It'll keep the horses and mules alive. Then we won't have to kill any of our animals." So they decided where each of them would look. Ahab went in one direction, Obadiah went in another. As Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him. He bowed down to the ground and said, "My master Elijah, is it really you?" "Yes," he replied. "Go and tell your master Ahab, Elijah is here." "What have I done wrong?" asked Obadiah. "Why are you handing me over to Ahab to be put to death? My master has sent people to look for you everywhere. There isn't a nation or kingdom where he hasn't sent someone to look for you. Suppose a nation or a kingdom would claim that you weren't there. Then Ahab would make them give their word that they couldn't find you. And that's just as sure as the Lord your God is alive. But now you're telling me to go to my master. You want me to say Elijah is here. But the Spirit of the Lord might carry you away when I leave. Then I won't know where you are. And if I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he'll kill me. But I've worshipped the Lord ever since I was young, my master. Haven't you heard what I did? Jezebel was killing the Lord's prophets, but I hid 100 of them in 2 caves. I put 50 in each cave and supplied them with food and water. And now you're telling me to go to my master Ahab? You want me to say him Elijah is here? Ahab will kill me." Elijah said, "I serve the Lord who rules over all, and you can be sure that he lives, and you can be just as sure that I will speak to Ahab today." Obadiah went back to Ahab. He told Ahab what Elijah wanted to see him. So Ahab went to where Elijah was. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you? You are always stirring up trouble in Israel." I haven't made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your family have. You've turned away from the Lord's commands. You've followed gods that are named Baal. You send for people from all over Israel. Tell them to meet me on Mount Carmel and bring the 450 prophets of the god named Baal. Also bring the 400 prophets of the female god named Asherah. All of them eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent that message through all Israel. He gathered the prophets together on Mount Carmel. Elijah went there and stood in front of the people. He said, "How long will it take you to make up your minds? If the Lord is the one and only God, worship him. But if Baal is the one and only God, worship him." Then the people did not say anything. Then Elijah said to them, "I'm the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves and let them cut it into pieces. Then let him put it on the wood. But don't let them set fire to it. I'll prepare the other bull. I'll put it on the wood, but won't set fire to it. Then you pray to your God, and I'll pray to the Lord. The God who answers by sending fire down is the one and only God." Then all the people said, What you are saying is good." Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls. There are many of you. So prepare your bull first. Pray to your God, but don't light the fire." So they prepared the bull they had been given. They prayed to Baal from morning until noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there wasn't any reply. No one answered. Then they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to tease them. "Shout louder," he said. "I'm sure Baal is a god. Perhaps he has too much to think about. Or maybe he's gone to the toilet. Or perhaps he's away on a trip. Maybe he's sleeping. You might have to wake him up." So they shouted louder. They cut themselves with swords and spears until their blood flowed. And that's what they usually did when things looked really hopeless. It was now past noon. The prophets of Baal continued to prophesy with all their might. They did it until the time came for the evening sacrifice, but there wasn't any reply. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." So they went to him. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord. It had been torn down. Elijah got 12 stones. There was one for each tribe in the family line of Jacob. The Lord's message had come to Jacob. It had said, "Your name will be Israel." Elijah used the stones to build an altar to honor the Lord. He dug a ditch around it. The ditch was large enough to hold 24 pounds of seed. He arranged for wood for the fire, and he cut the bull into pieces. He placed the pieces on the wood, and then he said to some of the people, "Fill 4 large jars with water. Pour it on the offering and the wood." So they did. "Do it again," he said. So they did it again. "Do it a third time," he ordered, and they did it a third time. The water ran down around the altar. It even filled the ditch. When it was time to offer the evening sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward. He prayed, "Lord, you are the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Today, let everyone know that you are God in Israel. Let them know I'm your servant. Let them know I've done all these things because you commanded me to. Answer me, Lord, answer me. Then these people will know that you are the one and only God. They'll know that you are turning their hearts back to you again." The fire of the Lord came down. It burned up the sacrifice. It burned up the wood and the stones and the soil. It even dried up the water in the ditch. All the people saw it. Then they fell down flat with their faces toward the ground. They cried out, "The Lord is the one and only God. The Lord is the one and only God." Then Elijah commanded them, "Grab the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one of them get away." So they grabbed them. Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley, and there he put them to death. Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink. I can hear the sound of a heavy rain." So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel. He bent down toward the ground, then he put his face between his knees. "Go and look toward the sea," he told his servant. So he went up and looked. "I don't see anything there." 7 times Elijah said, "Go back." The 7th time the servant said, "I see a cloud. It's as small as a man's hand, and it's coming up over the sea." Elijah said, "Go to Ahab. Tell him, tie your chariot to your horse. Go down to Jezreel before the rain stops you." Black clouds filled the sky. The wind came up, and a heavy rain began to fall. Ahab rode off to Jezreel, and the power of the Lord came on Elijah. He tucked his coat into his belt, and he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done. He told her how Elijah had killed all the prophets of Baal with his sword. So Jezebel sent a message to Elijah. She said, "You can be sure that I will kill you, just as I killed all the other prophets. I'll do it by this time tomorrow, and if I don't, may the gods punish me greatly." And right here, I really want the Bible to say something different than what it does. Like Elijah laughed in her face and she turned to stone, or Elijah used some jujitsu to subdue her and all Israel was saved. But it doesn't say that. It says, Elijah was afraid, so he ran for his life. He came to Beersheba in Judah. He left his servant there. Then he traveled for 1 day into the desert. He came to a small bush. He sat down under it. He prayed that he would die. "Lord, I've had enough," he said. "Take my life. I'm no better than my people of long ago." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him, and the angel said, "Get up and eat." Elijah looked around, and near his head he saw some bread. It had been baked over hot coals. A jar of water was also there. So Elijah ate and drank, and then he lay down again. A message came to Elijah from the Lord. He said, "Elijah, what are you doing here?" He replied, "Lord God, who rules over all, I've been very committed to you. The Israelites have turned their back on your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've put your prophets to death with their swords. I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me." The Lord said, "Go out, stand on the mountain in front of me. I'm going to pass by." As the Lord approached, a very powerful wind tore the mountains apart. It broke up the rocks, but the Lord wasn't in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire came, but the Lord wasn't in the fire. And after the fire, there was only a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his coat over his face. He went out and stood at the entrance to the cave. Then a voice said to him, Elijah, what are you doing here? He replied, Lord God, who rules over all, I've been very committed to you. The Israelites have turned their backs on your covenant, and they've torn down your altars. They've put your prophets to death with their swords. I'm the only one left, and they are trying to kill me. The Lord said to him, Go back the way you came. Go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu as king over Israel. He's the son of Nimshi. And anoint Elisha from Abel-Meholah as the next prophet after you. He's the son of Shaphat. Jehu will put to death anyone who escapes Hazael's sword, and Elisha will put to death anyone who escapes Jehu's sword. But I will keep 7,000 people in Israel for myself. They have not bowed down to Baal, and they have not kissed him. The angel of the Lord said to him a second time. The angel of the Lord came to him a second time. He touched him and said, Get up and eat. Your journey will be long and hard. So he got up, he ate and drank, and the food gave him new strength. He traveled for 40 days and 40 nights. He kept going until he arrived at Horeb. It was the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. When I was a kid, I grew up working at this Christian summer camp. It was called Park Springs Christian Centers in Providence, North Carolina. It's okay if you don't know where it is. I'm not sure I could even find it anymore. But every week of camp, they would have the kids at the end of the week usually act out some Bible scene. And one year, they decided to do this scene. And it was my favorite by far. We had a campfire area there that was probably roughly the size of these two middle sections with two concentric rings of benches. And then in North Carolina, they have these weird things where if you take enough dirt and you continually stack it on top of another one, it makes a hill. They don't have those in Florida. And so at the top of the hill, we had this really, really thin wire that we'd run down to the middle of the campfire. And we had a coat hanger that we'd wrapped around a piece of wood, around a piece of cloth. And at the right time, we were going to light this thing and let it slide down. It was the middle of the night, so nobody could see us up there. And it was going to be awesome. When we got to the part of the skit where they dumped water on the campfire, instead of doing water, they did half water and half diesel. Don't jump ahead yet. You'll ruin the story. And so, they're going through, and Elijah gives his speech, and, then we get the cue for the fire to come down from heaven. And we were smart about it. We had the kids on the outside perimeter of the benches. We thought we were smart. When it hit the campfire, it wasn't totally like Hollywood pyrotechnics, but fire just sort of crept along the ground in this mushroom cloud, and kids were running everywhere. I guarantee you, not a one of those campers will ever forget this story for the rest of their lives, and it's probably why it's one of my favorite stories. There were no lawsuits, nobody got burned or anything, but it was exciting for a few moments. So there are several things in this story that really jump out to me as just great concepts that I don't want us all to miss together. And you'll see these in sort of bulleted points on your outline. The first one that jumps out to me is that sarcasm is actually a form of worshiping God. That's not true. I'm kidding. Sarcasm isn't, but I love that the Bible is not this musty old history book. It's this living Word of God that explains to us that while Elijah is having a showdown, outnumbered basically 850 to 1, he's joking around with these guys that think they're actually worshiping a God. I love his responses to them. The first real observation then would be that your history doesn't dictate your future. Good or bad, you get to choose. But history has an impact on the future. Free will can kind of stink sometimes when you're on the bad receiving end of that. We have these kings, these people who were supposed to lead and shepherd the people, making bad decisions, and they were evil, and that led an entire nation to fall under the judgment of God. Israel had been delivered from Egypt, and 5 minutes on the other side of the Red Sea, they were building idols while Moses was receiving the Ten Commandments. They'd been delivered into the Promised Land, delivered by the judges of Israel, delivered from the hand of the Philistines by David, and delivered into superpower status by Solomon. Yet they turned away over and over and over again, which just proves that God is patient and merciful. I think the next observation is that maybe our view of God isn't great enough. There can be only one God. Elijah asked the people of Israel to choose between Baal or God. based on who was real. God doesn't share. I remember this preacher when I was a kid who used to say, God is God of all or not at all. And those are really the only two choices that you have for God in your life. It matters what we worship. What we give value and priority to in our lives matters. Name one time in the Bible when God asks for less than everything from someone who says they're willing to follow him. Imagine the audacity that it would take to say to him, yes, you are God, and I'm thankful that you've saved me, but no, I will not surrender that part of my life to you. I will not trust you fully. God is incredibly powerful. As if fire falling from heaven were not enough, the fire consumes both sacrifices, the wood on the altar, the stones, the very ground, and it vaporizes all the water that had been poured out. God can defy the laws of the natural world. Rain had been withheld from the land for 3 years. God basically turned ordinary ravens into Uber Eats delivery drivers with Elijah. God created endless bread and oil. He made water flammable. God brought dead people back to life. Death is not final to him. With all that power, God could speak to us with all of the power of creation. He could totally overwhelm us, but he uses a gentle whisper. Next, I think, is that maybe our view of sin isn't quite harsh enough. Maybe we don't really see sin for the horrible thing that it is. Maybe the hard time that some of us have with the idea of an eternal hell, well, that would go away if we had an accurate view of God and just how bad sin is. Some people say, but how could God send someone to hell to be tormented forever? Isn't that a bit of overkill? And I totally hear you. I understand that. But we have to all remember that God sets the choice in front of us, just as Elijah set the choice before the people of Israel. We can choose life. Doing the right thing is still the right thing, even if it could cost you your life. Obadiah illustrates that in the story. He was servant to Ahab the king. He knew that Ahab's wife was murdering prophets, and he chose to hide some because he feared God, and that was the right thing to do. The story also illustrates that doing the wrong thing, even if it's more convenient, is still the wrong thing. I think next is that miracles don't create faith. We can't rely on them to create our faith. Have you ever said, oh God, if you would only, and then fill in the blank, then I would believe? This text at least kind of argues against that sort of thinking. Elijah hears God's voice, is miraculously fed by birds, then by a never-ending bowl of flour and oil. He sees fire fall from heaven, and then he runs when he's threatened by Jezebel. The Bible is interesting in that it tells us the truth about people. If it were just a book of propaganda, then it sure does seem to pick some amazingly shady characters to highlight. Elijah, just like in this story, with all the things he witnessed, and then his lack of faith there at the end. Abraham, who was spoken to directly by God, called to follow God in a dramatic way, gave up his wife multiple times to other men for fear that they would kill him to try and take his wife. Moses, who again, called directly by God to deliver the people, doubted that he could be used by God. Samson was just an idiot, even though we know all of the things that he did throughout his life. David was a murdering adulterer. Peter witnessed the very presence of Jesus and denied his association with him for fear of an adolescent girl. Don't get me wrong, I love girls. I have lots of little girls that live in my house. My whole family is pretty much girls. But they don't exactly strike fear into the hearts of burly fishermen, right? And that's what Peter was. And he turned as soon as he was confronted by one. So God is the God of miracles, but we can't rely on those for faith. And the Bible doesn't try to encourage us to do that either. God still continued to use those people, even despite their failings, just like he can use us despite our failings. God's provision for Elijah, his miraculous provision, meant also blessings for the widow and her son. Don't miss this too. When God blesses you in a supernatural sort of way, don't fall into the trap of thinking that that is just for you. God's faithful provision that happens all the time is also something that I think we should all consider in our lives. You'll notice that at the bottom, you've got a couple of things for follow-up that are worth thinking about later. One is to make a list of all the ways that God has blessed you and then share those with somebody. My list is pretty extensive. God blessed my wife and I with a house not incredibly long ago, that needed a whole lot of sweat equity when we moved in, but it was, and it is big enough for the large family that God has also blessed us with. Related to that, I have this amazing, beautiful woman that somehow has managed to tolerate me for the past 17 years, and that's a continual blessing in my life. So you ought to spend some time making a list of the ways that God has blessed you. Next is that you aren't done. No matter your station in life or your age, God can still use you. Abraham and Sarah were 100 years old when they were promised a child. After God corrects Elijah, after this huge ordeal against these prophets, he doesn't say to Elijah, okay, it's time to retire, but he says to him, get up, eat, and get ready for a long, hard journey. No one on their deathbed is going to remember with fondness the days of doing nothing. You're going to remember the great days, right? I mean, how horrible would that be to think that, well, from here on out, it's all downhill. Nothing good is going to happen again, nothing powerful. You're going to remember days like your wedding or the birth of a child. Maybe you served in our armed forces and you might remember some endeavor that you survived, some adventure that you had with your family, the day you finally said no to your addiction and stopped victimizing yourself and took responsibility. You'll remember those days. You won't remember days of shuffleboard or binge watching Netflix though, right? The days full of promise and pain and tragedy and triumph, those will be the ones that when our lives are coming to an end, we'll remember fondly. So I'd like to call all of us, no matter where we are on that age continuum, where we are in our station in life, there are lots of ways that you could be serving here, that you could be serving the kingdom here. We have a great one coming up here of a foster and adoptive parent night out. There's lots of ministries to our kids here in church that could use your help. Amy just started her children's ministry position, and she could use volunteers. Brandon in Elevate, he could use volunteers with students. There are lots of ways that you could get plugged in. Next is this interesting idea in the Bible of the remnant. It's a bit of a fancy church word, but there's this idea that's woven throughout Scripture that even when it seems like the whole world is against God, he's always preserving a group that's faithful to him. And then lastly, this story is an interesting reminder of a truth that we all know, and that there's coming a day of judgment or deliverance. And you get to choose. God is a God of order. He's good, and he defines good. All of his actions are right. He's holy, and he asks us to be holy, and yet we can't. We can't be holy. By right, we deserve condemnation because we choose. I choose. I choose to consistently do what he tells me not to do, or I choose consistently not to do what he asks me to do. I break his rules. I tell him I know better than him by the way that I live, and the truth is that the only person I'm fooling there is me. I deserve to be punished. And here it is again, but God. But God wouldn't let the story end there, so he sent Jesus to take the punishment that I earn and I deserve. Lamentations 3:22 and 23 says, his great love is new every morning. Lord, how faithful you are. I say to myself, the Lord is everything I will ever need, so I'll put my hope in him.